And this morning we are privileged to have with us Dr. Harriet Patterson. Harriet is an author of the book Rethinking, Learning to Read, and she's also done quite a lot of other research as well with Alan Thomas. Am I right?
Yes.
You could speak a little bit about that, and I'm sure you probably reference it in your PowerPoint or whatever. And Harriet is also someone who home educated her own children. So she has a lot of experience. She's done a lot of observation. I really enjoy listening to everything Harriet has to say. She was our keynote speaker a couple of years ago at Learn Free when I think our last live conference. And we're just thrilled that she comes back every time. So thank you, Harriet. And I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me back, and thank you everybody for coming along for one of my favourite things, which is talking about about reading and about reading research. So yeah, like Juliet said, we started out as a home educating family. Our children got 3 children, and none of them went to school. They're all big and grown up now and gone off doing other things, but they didn't go into formal education until they were 16, 17. So, and when we went into home education, we didn't go into it with any sort of particular philosophical or pedagogical aspirations, which is sort of the fancy way of saying I didn't really know what I was doing. But our elder daughter, had had a very brief and very traumatic experience at nursery. Nobody had the appetite to go through that again. And there were 3 children at home quite close together in age. We were having a really nice time, and it just didn't seem to be sufficient reason to break that up. So and I think, like most people setting out on home education, once you've got the bit between your teeth, really excited about it. I was just reading everything that I could get my hands on, trying to find out more about it. And I remember I joined EO, and I remember the EO newsletter and reading a couple of accounts in the EO newsletter about children who apparently had spontaneously started reading. They hadn't been taught, but their parents were writing in and just describing how this thing had just happened. And I can actually remember reading those accounts and thinking, wow, that is so amazing. Just imagine that. Just imagine if one day your child just turns around and they can read. And at the same time that I was thinking that, I was also thinking, yeah, but it hasn't really got very much to do with us. Down here in the paddy fields of real life, they must be exceptional children. They must be very rare cases. Sooner or later, we're going to have to, think about this learning to read thing, because that's kind of the big sort of early years educational mountain, isn't it? That we all know that we've got to climb. Anyway, we were blessed because our elder daughter, she was a wonderful child to learn to home educate on. She was interested in all the right things. She just made life really easy. And she was interested in, she liked listening to stories. I would read to her a lot. She'd get books by herself and sit and turn over the pages and, tell herself a story, pretend she was reading as she was going along. She could recognize her own name. Since she was about 3, something like that. Sometimes she'd want to write something down. She'd get me to write it, and then she would copy it. So I knew that there were bits and pieces going on. They didn't, in my mind, they didn't add up to any kind of a whole, but I knew that there were bits and pieces, and I didn't feel any need to push those bits and pieces forward in any way. Anyway, what happened was she wasn't far off 6, and my mum gave her a book. And the book she gave her was, it was Hop on Pop. It was Dr. Seuss' book, Hop on Pop. Very simple. If you don't know, it's very simple, Dr. Seuss phonics reader. And I have pondered so deeply on this. But that book came into our house. My mum gave it to Hope and said to her, this is the book for you to read. And nobody had ever suggested to her that she read something for herself before. If we'd gone to the library, we'd gone to a bookshop, we'd chosen books, but it was always on the agenda that I would read the books to the children. Nobody had ever suggested to her that she read something for herself before. And that's what she did. She took this book off and she read it. She didn't ask me to help her. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't read it to me. She just took this book, and we knew that she was reading it. Sometimes she said the words out loud. Sometimes she said, she was sitting doing it silently to herself. She had her nose in it for weeks, wouldn't be separated from this book. And eventually, you know, she'd had enough of it. She went and put it into the bookshelf, took out another book that was there and went off and read that. And that was it, she could read. And I was, even now when I think about it, I just remember I was mind blown. You know, I always think of that expression, knock me down with a feather, because if somebody had had a feather and they'd knocked me with it, I would have been swept off my feet. You know, I could not get my head around what had happened. And there were two things, there were two questions in particular that were just, you know, just kept flapping around in my brain. And the first one was, how would she manage to do something so difficult by herself? You know, when you look at accounts of learning to read, they talk about so many different skills that children have to have, so many things that they have to be able to do. So much knowledge about letters and letter sounds and letter blends and distinguishing parts of speech and so on. And I was thinking, how could she have worked all of that out by herself? And the other thing that kind of really deepened and mystified that question was, you know, I was with her all the time. You know, we were a home educating family. I knew what she did minute by minute, hour by hour of every, you know, of all her waking life. And yet I hadn't seen anything going on, you know, and I just couldn't think, how can I have missed this? How can I have missed this seismic piece of learning? You know, how come I don't know, that I didn't recognize that this thing was happening? Anyway, I got quite obsessed with this question, but I can't let this go. I can't let this go. I have to think about how can I sort of at least start to find out about what's happened right under my own nose, without me knowing anything about it. So I have got some slides here, so I will start sharing now. Not that there's an awful lot on them. Done that one. Oh, what's happened to my slide? It's got some musical notation on it that it shouldn't have.
It might just be that whatever you're using to play it doesn't read the font in the same way.
Oh,
so you may have had bullet points and perhaps it's
just
retranslated or something.
It's just about readable. I'll talk over it. Anyway, so yeah, so as Juliet was saying, I was working with Alan Thomas at the time and we had a website. So I wrote up a questionnaire, I put it on the website, advertised it round as widely as I could, because my instinct was, you know, I have to talk to other people. I have to find out what happens in other families, you know, and thinking back to those accounts that I'd read about originally and you know, just wanted to talk to people about this experience. Got an amazing response, got a truly amazing response to this questionnaire. I've got 311 returns, which covered a nice round number of 400 children and 215 boys, 184 girls. And there were 2 adults joined the research because they had been home educated themselves and were reflecting back on that experience. So it's important to say, this is not quantitative research. We can't sort of extrapolate from it and say things like, you know, the average age that a home educated child learns to read is X, or, you know, 50% of home educated children learn in this way and 50% in that way, or anything like that. It's not a random sample, and we can't extrapolate anything quantitative or statistical from it. What it does do, and what I think it really did really well, I can't believe it. See if somebody else gets that. What it did really, really well was show the possibilities across learning to read, show the parameters and the diversity of learning to read. So I'm going to break the talk into sort of like 3 sections. Hold on. One of the pleasures of being live at home, isn't it? So I'm going to look at 4 questions. As I say, we haven't got very long. I am anxious to talk about what people want to talk about, so we'll try and keep an eye on the chat and see if any questions come in there. But I thought we'd look at how children learn to read, what they learn to read, why they learn to read, and when they learn to read, and just sort of have a little bite at each of those. So when I went into this, when I started the research, what I imagined would happen would be that we'd get some people who were very structured. I mean, I was very keen to encompass all experiences of learning to read at home. And one of the great things about the sample when it came in was there was huge diversity across it. So there were families who'd followed programs and were more structured in their approach. There were autonomous families, there were religiously motivated families, there were philosophically, pedagogically motivated families, there were families who never imagined that they would end up home educating, and things had happened, and that was the situation that they had found themselves in. There were children who'd been in school, children who'd never been to school, children who'd come out of school sometimes because reading was the problem. Reading had been the catalyst, difficulties with reading had been the catalyst that drew them out of school. So what I imagined when I went into it in terms of how the children had learnt to read was that I was going to find a group of people who'd been quite structured and had had reading programs and plans and had followed those through, and other people who would be quite autonomous and had let things develop in a more kind of organic, child-led way. And sure, we got those people. We got people, there was one family, they put the alphabet chart up next to the baby's cot when she was 6 months old. You know, they had done everything step by step in a really organised way. They weren't alone, there were other families too doing that. And then we had, you know, the most laid back autonomous families that you can imagine. He's, you know, said, well, we didn't do anything, we didn't even really think about it. But what was really interesting was the everything that came in between. Because whereas I'd seen this as being sort of two ends of a spectrum, or of a spectrum, it was everything in between that was really fascinating, because people were responsive, they were flexible, they were creative, they were making things up, they were taking bits of you know, from all sorts of places and readapting them, reusing them, refashioning them for their families, for what their children were interested in. And there were all sorts of really rich, diverse ideas coming out of that, the games that people played, the things that they set up, the things that they did with their children, you know, sometimes adaptations of formal things, sometimes just really casual things, but so much flexibility and responsiveness going on within that everything in between. And one of the things that became really apparent was that because of the way that people adapted and responded to things, was that no two children had the same experience. The experiences were really diverse. And that kind of pushed my thinking away from those ideas. You know, when I was thinking about our daughter Hope and thinking about how she had learned, and I had that checklist in my mind, you know, how does she know what sound a P makes? You know, how does she know how to blend the letters T and H together? You know, how does she know that you read from left to right? And that kind of long checklist of things that I had. Reading this data and these families' experiences was pushing me away from that, because it was becoming more and more obvious that children had unique experiences. So I know we talk about that a lot. The rhetoric around formal education is about unique individuals, but we all know that the reality is really standardized. And this was not standardized at all. You know, this really was a unique experience for every single child. And so, you know, we need to rethink. This is the rethinking part. We need to rethink what is common about these experiences, because it's not this list of kind of skills and input that I'd been imagining in my mind. So I can see some questions coming in. I'll just do this next slide to finish off this bit, and then I'll have a look at the questions. So it seemed to me in that rethink that we needed to kind of categorize what goes on when a child learns to read a little bit differently. And these are the things that I came up with that I think were common to all of these children in their various different experiences. So one of them was people. They had people around them who were responsive to them, responsive to their interests, their needs, what they wanted out of life. I think that was really important. Children had interests, and that didn't necessarily need to be an interest in reading, but they had interests in life. They had things that they wanted to get into, you know, things that they wanted to find out about, things that they wanted to do. They had opportunities. opportunities, and because of the big diversity, because of there's so much difference in the stories that people were telling me about reading. Because of the difference in those, it was clear that everybody had different opportunities in their lives, but they had opportunities to pick things up, to follow things, to follow those interests. And love, by which I didn't actually mean sort of family love and loving parents, because I'm kind of taking that as a given. But what a lot of people really emphasized was, I really want my child to love reading. I really want them to discover this amazing world of literacy. I really want them to love that experience. I really want them to love books. I really want them to be passionate about literature. I really want this to be something that's really important in their lives. And that kind of created the environment, much more so than an idea of, you know, I want my child to pass this test, or I want my child to be, you know, at an age-related stage, or, you know, that kind of more technical progression. And the other thing that seemed to be really important was chance, because it wasn't always obvious what was going to happen in a family. Things happened by chance, which makes it sound as if, you know, it's a bit dodgy because it could happen or it couldn't happen. But I don't mean it in that sense. What I mean is that things that hadn't been planned fell into place. So to give you an example, one dad told me about his two sons, and they were both really into this children's singing group called the Wiggles. And apparently they loved the Wiggles, and they spent ages listening to the Wiggles songs and watching the videos and singing along, and they knew all the words, and really into this group. So that is the interest part. So one of the boys said to his dad, could he write out the words for the songs for him? So his dad made him a folder, typed out the words of the songs and made him a folder with all the song words in it. So that was the people part. That was the responsive part of his dad joining in this project, this interest in this singing group. And then the little boy took the folder and went away and spent the afternoon working out what the words said. He already knew the words to the songs. So all he had to do was work out the one-to-one correlation when he had the words in front of him. And that was how he learned to read. Now, the love was there, this enjoyment, the pleasure that he got out of listening to the songs, you know, the love that he had for the music and the enjoyment all around that. The opportunity was there because he was interested in this singing group, and somebody had brought in the tapes and set it up for him and enabled him to follow that interest. But the chance was there as well, because nobody had said, really like you to get into this singing group, son, you know, why don't you learn the words of the songs? Nobody had the intention that this was a route into reading. This was what had just happened. So I'll just take a quick look at the chat questions. So see if we've got, no, the website, we don't have the website any longer, sadly. Really nice comment from Victoria. That's really kind of you, and really great. And Nikki said it seems like a miracle. It does. When you know, when you think about, you know, the way that, you know, when I first described it, I said, you know, we all know that reading's the mountain that we've got to climb, because that's what it feels like, you know, and there is so much pressure to get up that mountain, you know, and if you can't get up it, it's so problematic. And all of that and the home education stories, and all of that seemed to fade away. There were different stories from children who'd been in school and come out of school, you know, in distress over reading. So Victoria's saying, is where reading difficulties such as dyslexia fit into this organic child-led ways of learning to read. Some symptom lists only reference the age at which children learn different reading skills at school. Yeah, okay. So we did have families where children had dyslexia or had problems learning to read, either diagnosed as things like dyslexia or undiagnosed. And I have to say that what tended to happen was that when the children were in school and the pressure was on and there was a lot of distress around it, and the reaction of parents who took their children out of school because of that was very often just to leave reading alone, to stop trying to teach their children to read, stop trying to, you know, get over the difficulties and instead go off and do something else. And one of the most remarkable stories that came out of all of this was an 8-year-old girl. She came out of school when she was 8 years old. She was diagnosed with dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, I think something else on the list, in extreme distress. Her mum said that she couldn't even recognise her own name. And they couldn't go near it. They couldn't go near reading. She was just too upset, just too traumatized about it. Her parents had been told that she was in the bottom 3% in the country. So her mum said, we just did other things, and we furthered her education in other ways. And eventually, when she was a teenager, she came back to reading and started reading by herself. She wasn't taught. She started picking up reading by herself. She went to college when she was 18. She went to college, and as an adult, she said, she loved reading books. And it's a, when you use the word miracle, I mean, in our education system, that is pretty much a miracle, because if you're in the bottom 3%, you don't go on to college. You don't end up reading for pleasure. The story out of the education system, and it's not anti-school, it's the way that things are, is that, if you are not reading by age standard, by the time you leave primary school, it is a very bleak future, because everything that you do in school depends on your ability to read and write. And if you can't read and write, you just can't access the rest of the curriculum. And it's very, very rare that children ever recover the ground that's lost through not reading at school. It's a very different story that comes out of the home education research. I'll just zip back to some questions. Yeah, this is what her mum said. Yeah, she at age 14 she started looking at things in print, and started reading by herself. And I'm going to talk later on, a bit later on through the slides, about the effect of this kind of being in a literate environment, and the drip, 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 if you like, of the literate environment, as opposed to the schedule and the idea of being able to do specific skills in discrete blocks, but just the drip, drip, drip of living in the literate environment. And I think that probably had a lot to do with her eventually coming around to reading. Yeah, and Natalia, I'm really sorry to read that. It's not an unknown experience. Through the research, a lot of people told us similar stories and said, that things had gone wrong, and children had got upset and distressed, and decided that they didn't want to read. And the story that I've just told you is probably, well, there are about 3 stories that were as dramatic as that one, but there were also lots of other cases where parents said, children came out of school, they were fed up with reading, they just didn't want to do it anymore because they just associated it with bad things. And again, it was kind of a smaller scale, well, let's not do any reading for 6 months, let's go off and get busy with other things. And those children came back to it. So we turn to the what of learning to read. So as you can see from the things that I talked about in the how of learning to read, we've got this sort of really rich diversity. And yeah, there were children, where families had gone down the more structured route, and they started their early reading in the place that we would expect, which is, well, I suppose like our daughter, like Hop on Pop, with, material that is designed for early readers. But there were also a whole load of other stories about the things that children read. And very often, like the Wiggles thing, it was to do with some other interest that the child had. So that example was singing, but there was lots of talk about computer games, online games, board games, card games, where children, started reading particular things that they were interested in reading. Lots of talk about environmental print, just the words that you see, when you think about that drip, drip effect of literacy, we are surrounded by the written word. One mum said, if you ask my son if he read, he would say no, because he thinks that reading is sitting down with a book. But actually he's reading all the time, because there's all this stuff around him, on the computer, in the street, labels on things, in the kitchen, all the rest of it. And he's reading that. But what he's not doing is sitting down with a book. So loads of those things going on, texting and communication, lots of interest in that. And where children had particular interests, like the wildlife book there was one boy really passionate about nature, and he wanted to read nature books. So that was what he started reading. And because of that, sometimes children started reading really unexpected material. I mean, there were cases where the first book that a child had read was a Harry Potter book. One girl read Lord of the Rings as the first book that she had ever read. So there were, just amazing stories that really turned upside down the idea that, everybody is going to start with Hop on Pop and make their way through. Just have a quick look at the questions. So, oh yes, so Kat said exactly what happened to us. Our 4-year-old came out of school hating books, left him for nearly a year, and suddenly realised he was reading. Yeah, and I think it, when you first hear these stories, a bit like me reading those accounts in the EO newsletter all those years ago, and you think, this is amazing, but it hasn't really got anything to do with us. We're going to have to work this thing out somehow for ourselves. But actually, the more I found out about it, the more I found actually these stories, they are amazing. They're still amazing, but they're not rare. They're not rare. All of this is perfectly doable. And the analogy is often made about learning to talk. Something that children pick up. They pick up from their environment in their own way. Mind you, learning to talk is being colonised now, isn't it, by early years education, in the same way maybe that reading has been colonised. But that's another subject. So why did children learn to read? So one reason was teaching. And lots of parents, especially those who had gone down the more structured routes, had taught their children to read. They'd gone into a process of teaching and they'd come out the other end with a child who was reading. There were other families who said things like, I tried to teach, but the teaching actually interfered. And looking back on it, I wish I hadn't done it because the teaching put too much pressure on both of us. There were other families where people were all set up and ready to teach, and then their child had either rejected it and said, I don't want to do this, and they had dropped the idea, or they had found that actually when they went to teach their child, the child already knew what they were trying to teach them, and that they were sort of running after them with the teaching. I think I came out of it sort of feeling that it doesn't matter, as the parent, you will know your child, your situation, and yourself. And it's those three things that will decide what you do about teaching, or, whether you teach, whether you go down the structured route, whether you leave it alone. If you teach, and a lot of people put the teach in inverted commas, well, yeah, I did things with him or her, we played lots of games, we read lots of books, but I didn't see myself as teaching. And again, I think it's part of that responsiveness to the situation that really does make those unique individual experiences of reading. So other reasons why children learned: self-motivation. Lots of parents talked about motivation, and that motivation could be general or it could be particular. So general motivation, when children or families decided, now's the time to learn to read. And some parents simply said, well, she was ready to move on to reading books. And there was kind of a general motivation. The young man that joined in the research, looking back on his childhood and his experiences of learning to read, said that he didn't read till he was 12. And he said by the time he got to 12, he said, I just got fed up of asking other people to read things for me. And I just thought, life would be a lot easier if I did this for myself. So he did. And then there were particular reasons for learning to read. When children wanted, it's not so much that they wanted to be able to read, it's that they wanted to read particular things. And the gaming cards or the online games was a really typical example of that. Children wanted to be able to read those particular things. One mum said her son was into these gaming cards, and she said he used to keep coming to me and saying, what does it say? What does it say? And she said, I knew he could read when he didn't come anymore. He was playing the game by himself and reading the cards for himself. sometimes the particular, there was what one lady wrote about reading to her daughter. This wasn't an isolated case either, but she was reading a book to her daughter and it was getting really grippy and exciting. And then the mum couldn't go on. She had to go off and do something else. And was like, well, I can't wait for you to come back. I've got to start reading this for myself. I've got to find out what happens next. So really particular reasons for children starting reading on their own, because they're surrounded by it. And again, one parent said, you know, it'd be really hard not to learn to read in our environment because you know, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Really difficult not to learn to read, not to start recognizing some of this print. And a lot of parents talked about osmosis. They talked about learning by osmosis. You know, this just kind of seeping into children, not effortful, not directed, but just seeping into them through that drip drip of everyday life. And another thing that really interested me was because it's easy. Children learn because it's easy. And again, that kind of turns on its head our kind of social, educational understanding of reading, that reading is actually difficult. You know, that it pulls all these things together, that children have to concentrate, they have to put in lots of effort over several years until they master this thing. And there were some other cases in the research, but I also, our son, I felt fell into this category because he wasn't motivated to read at all. He wasn't interested. He wasn't interested. He certainly wasn't going to put in any effort into doing something like reading The Cat in the Hat, you know, because there's nothing in it for him. You know, he wasn't interested in cats and hats, and he certainly wasn't interested in putting effort into it. And he didn't read until it became easy for him to read. When it was easy and it didn't take any effort, then he'd occasionally read something, but he wasn't going to do it when he had to put effort into it. And I suppose it became easy to him because of that kind of osmosis process that nobody, not even he, recognized was happening, you know, just that constant surrounded by it. I'll dive back into the chat. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that cat that children. Yeah, in fact, I've got a little. I'll show you my next slide on. So I drew these. You know, the learning curve, the slide with the learning curve on, and it's that kind of gentle upward slope, and we always think this is how people learn. You know, you start off at the bottom where it's easy and then you go gradually up this slope and it gets more and more difficult, and that's over time. So as time goes by, you're getting better and better at things, and that learning curve, it did fit some of the stories, but some of the stories it just didn't fit, and so I think what Kat's describing, I would put maybe here as an incremental incline, that children learnt a bit and then it kind of plateaued because they weren't doing it, or they'd lost interest, or it got a bit difficult, or, you know, something else in life had taken over, and then they'd learn a bit more, you know, and it would progress like that. And sometimes those plateaus, they lasted for years. There was one mum said, you know, her son, he could recognize all the little words when he was sort of 4 or 5, and then he just totally lost interest, didn't come back to reading till he was about 9 or 10. So a really long plateau period, and then all of a sudden he was there, he could do it. The non-progressive one, I always think this was our daughter. This was our daughter Hope, you know, because you know, it seemed that she couldn't read, and then all of a sudden she could, and that was it, you know. And the other ones sort of fitted into other stories that we got told along the way. Right, so when did children learn to read? When it suited them. There was a lot of talk about children being ready, and I think that the ready was not used so much in terms of, you know, pre-reading skills and the kind of way that reading readiness, or ready for school, not that kind of ready, but ready in their own minds, at the point in their lives when they wanted to do this thing, when it made sense to them. And that could be anywhere between 18 months and 16 years. So the youngest child in the research where the parents said she could read was 18 months. And they said that because she could recognize logos. And I kind of puzzled over this. Is recognizing a logo reading? And I decided that, yes, it was. You know, if you're looking at a logo and you're extrapolating meaning from it, that's what you do with letters. And the whole idea that letters are sounds in speech is something that's superimposed over that, because we can easily look at a symbol that has no letters in it and we don't turn it into speech, but we know what it says. So, for example, a red traffic light. You know, it doesn't say something in the way that the word when at the top of the slide says something, but we look at it and we know what it means. And if you look at a word and you know what it means, you're reading. The oldest child was 16 years and she was the eldest, but there were other late teenagers as well, you know, like the 14-year-old who had had the bad experience in school. And one of the things to say about the children who learned later on was that they seemed to learn really quickly. As I say, you know, one girl, the first book that she ever read was Lord of the Rings. You know, it wasn't the case, as it's usually considered to be in education, that learning to read takes a particular length of time. And if you start at 5, you will be at, you know, point A by the time you're 7. But if you start at 7, you won't get to point A until you're 9. That didn't seem to pertain at all. And the children who learned late learned very fast. And there were children reading age, you know, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, you know, as I say, you know, going on to college with their cohort. So there was no apparent long-term consequence of reading later. Yeah, processes and turning points, and I asked on the questionnaire, I asked people how old their children were when they learned to read, and it was great about doing research with home educators. Everybody's really feisty, you know, and they take issue with the questions and say, you know, you can't ask that question because that question doesn't take into account. And lots of people quite rightly said, not putting an age on that, you know, they start when they're born, you know, and you don't ever finish. If you keep reading, you keep learning to read. So lots of people saw it as a process, as something that was ongoing, and I can't put an age on it. Some people frankly said, I don't know, I think he might have been 8 or 9, you know, because they were not so involved and sort of looking for the benchmarks that we tend to look for in reading. They, you know, so it's, you know, they've got a vague idea, you know, about when their child started reading. But there were other families, and again, you know, I felt like this with our elder daughter, where you suddenly went from a situation where they weren't reading to a situation where they were, and that there was this definite, you know, turning point of that line going straight up on the graph. So we've talked about these. And yeah, this one over here on the right is the book about learning to read, and it's Mike Wood published it at Educational Heretics Press, and this isn't a plug because it won't make me rich if you buy it. But one of the things that I felt about all of this and gathering these amazing collection of stories together and trying to sort through them and learn from them is that this is a really nice resource for home educators to have these things collected and together, you know, and you know, if you're setting out or you know you're worried about reading, you know, to be able to find out, so like that position that I was in at the beginning and thinking, you know, I just want to know what happened in other families, just want to know what other people made of these situations, to be able to do that. So and of course, you can always write to me. This is my email address, and it's got these funny marks in it again. But that's my email address, and I'm always really happy to talk to people about reading. And if I can, to answer any questions or yeah, just chat about it. So I'll stop there. Shall I stop my screen share? I've got one more question. Yeah, so my kids love reading in Minecraft. Minecraft came up a lot. lots of people were really into Minecraft or World of Warcraft. What's it called? World of Warcraft.
I think
That
it was
one.
something like that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, and the kind of the kids' crazes kind of things. You know, the popular things going around at the time. Okay, so Nikki's saying he's finding it frustrating, and how can I help him? I guess it's a case of the two of you finding anything really that he can do that without that frustration, to do just for the fun of it. I mean, one of the things, I mean, if it's reading that he wants to do, one of the things that he could do is read something that he already knows. So if he's got a favorite story or a story that he really likes to listen to, or a book that he really enjoys, you know, like the little boy with the Wiggles songs, you know, he already knew what those words said. So if he's got something that he's interested in like that, then he could look at that book and he could read that book first of all. And if he hasn't got something in the moment that he's interested, maybe you could find something that he knows by heart now. Maybe you could find something that would fill that slot, and that would ease some of the frustration. Yeah, I mean, like Victoria said, families did loads of these things. They found out what suited them. You know, stopping at particular words, or a child reading a particular part of it, or and again, it was that kind of one mum told me that her daughter wrote down strings of letters, and then they would go and look at the strings of letters and see if they could find a word in it. It was just making up those kind of games, that kind of interaction together. And as I say, it wasn't, it's not so much that, you could do this or you could do that, because people weren't using these things as methods. They were just using them to satisfy the moment, to satisfy, the need, and to have fun in the moment. And it just so happened, which is sort of, what I meant by the chance element in all of this. You look back and you can see how they got there, but going forwards, you're not going down a pre-planned route. Any more questions? Or anybody want to say anything or tell us about their family?
I can perhaps just share from some of the things I did, because with 7 children, we had very different experiences. So obviously with the first children, I was home. My one daughter was reading before she went to school. And that was really just because we did like a sort of flashcard thing, and she was kind of open to it. And the approach was quite simple. It was, they told you, don't ever do it if the child seems unwilling. So you just do a few words at a time, and help them just understand. It was always like, oh, look, this says head. Can you point your head? And you kind of do that kind of thing. It all actually started with logos, that approach, which was kind of cool. So it started with, say, you'd cut out like a Kellogg sign or something that they saw every day. And you'd say, you'd sort of say to them, oh, do you know what this says? Or you'd point to a Coca-Cola bottle or something. And they'd say, and they'd kind of look at you and quizzically, and then I'd say, well, and then they'd say, does it say this? And I'd say, yes, it's a yes. You can actually read, because reading is making sense of scribbles, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how the scribbles are shaped and formed. So it started off with very familiar things, and then after they kind of were good at a few of those, and you actually would cut out I would use the actual logo in its proper format, font, everything. And then we would do names of the family members, because that was also something near and dear, and they kind of came, and sometimes they already recognized them, because they'd seen them enough. And then we kind of did things. So you start with anything on the head, and it was eye, nose, and I had one son who would like cheerfully, he'd like, does it say ear? No, it says eye, and then you do it again later on. Does it say ear? No, it says eye. And you just got to it's very positive. And so we just would do that very lightly. And you do it like several times a day, but just for short little bursts. Keep it fun, keep it light. And if they weren't progressing, you just leave it. You don't, no emotion. It shouldn't become something where you're frustrated or the child is frustrated. And that kind of worked quite well for some of them. And for others, they picked up while the other sibling was learning. so
Yeah.
so I had a 2-year-old learning the words when her big sister was learning them.
Yeah.
And then, I had a computer game, which was really fun, which you can't get anymore, or I don't think, you can't get it compatible with the modern systems, but it was called Reader Rabbit. And Reader Rabbit, they played a game and it had little books and it came with the actual physical books that were actually in the game. So my one son learned to read just from that. And then I had the one, as I said, who cheerfully would get everything wrong every time. He was cheerful, and he only really got into reading sort of around 8, and then he was one of the more voracious readers. So it's always interesting that, if, let's just put it this way, forcing a child to read generally has never worked well for anybody.
I think it's really interesting that you're saying, everybody in the family was different, because that happened a lot as well. And, sort of when I think about our elder daughter and say, she was a wonderful child to learn to home educate on, and there were quite a few families where, they'd had that experience. They'd had a really easy child, who'd started reading at 5 or 6 or whatever. And then they'd get the 9-year-old or the 10-year-old who wasn't interested and wasn't reading, and it was amazing. And and you think that those children have the same genes, they grow up in the same environment, but they react differently to it. And sort of, there is, amongst the many myths of reading, are that if children in school are not reading, it's because they come from the wrong environment. The parents haven't modeled properly, what they're supposed to do. The home learning environment is lacking, and those kind of things. But looking at this research, you can see that, that's far too simplistic an answer, because the same children reacted differently to the different environment.
Yeah. And we have to avoid comparison. So a family, obviously, where it's gone easy with that particular child, might think that they've got it sussed and the other family just don't have a clue. But the thing is your next child could be totally different. So the comparison is not a healthy thing.
And I mean, I think all the way through the comparison, and I know people talked about it a lot. They talked about the pressure on them as parents, and the pressure on the children to meet these kind of benchmarks that have just been, and they're random benchmarks, but they are so reified in education, that if you're not doing this at this age, that's not normal, and you've got to do something about it, and there's got to be a problem, and that problem must be diagnosed, and you've got to address it early on, and you're a bad parent if you don't, and we are so surrounded by that kind of pressure. But what came out of the research, people were aware of that, but they were also aware of the fact that actually, that's not true. And as I say, there were children learning to read at 10, 12, young teenagers. Not a problem. It wasn't because they had some kind of issue that needed to be sorted out by a professional, and it didn't mean that they were going to spend the next 10 years, frantically trying to catch up on what they've missed. And one of the reasons I think why that's not the case is because we normally think about reading as something that you learn to do in order that you can read. But very often for the home educated families, children were very literate. They were highly literate. They had been read to, they had listened to stories, they had had discussions and talks and followed up their interests, and they had all of that behind them before they started reading, rather than thinking reading is what enables that kind of thing. And that meant that reading just, when they did learn to read, it just kind of slotted into what they already knew. There wasn't ground to make up. There was nothing to make up.
Yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I think this is the thing, and it's interesting. I've mentioned it a few times, but there's a video that I've added in the article sharing on the app, which is, this is what your brain looks like when it plays, or something like that. It's the former CEO of the Lego Foundation, and she was listing all the other skills that a child learns through play, and she was focusing on play, all the unseen skills that a child is learning just through playing, being exposed to the world, that she said are actually far greater indicators of success than whether or not a child can read and write at the age of 5. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are actually a whole host of skills that a child will need going into life. And as a child, generally leaving a child to be a child, to play, to have a childhood, tends to, relaxing entirely. And my thing was always, oh, they're only 6. They're still only 7. They're still, relax and allow them to embrace everything that the world has to offer, because it will all actually come when they're ready, because there are little miracles that way.
And yeah, and I do think that we do suffer in the UK with our early school starting age and our early expectations, when children in other schools, they're not expected to learn to read until they're 7. And if our children aren't reading by 7, it's, what's gone wrong here? What's the problem? This needs investigating, and that whole machinery setting into process, and that machinery itself can be very damaging.
Yeah.
I think as home educators, being able to resist that pressure, and a lot of parents talked about, the need to protect their children from that pressure and give them the space to do this thing in their own time and in their own way.
Yeah, reading is another form of making sense of the world.
Yeah.
It's the world we live in. So, hundreds or thousands of years ago, when, when a lot of people couldn't read, it was because it wasn't part of the world that they were entering. Only certain people read, and the others kind of just, well, I'm sure they got on just fine within the systems as they were, because that's what you learn. And it is, reading is definitely making sense of the world you're going into, and children will be exposed to it. They will be exposed to words and letters and shapes and forms, and they're going to make sense of it in their own way.
Well, this is my social anthropological side coming out, but all societies use symbols, systems of symbols, and use those to transmit meaning. That's what culture is. It's the symbolic transmission of meaning. And we separate out reading as if it is something separate and different. But actually, all the time we are using symbols to represent other things, words being, a prime example.
Yeah.
And anybody who's had anything to do with little children knows that children get symbols. The banana's a phone, the box is a car. They are very, very good at using symbols. So there is absolutely no reason why they wouldn't learn to read.
Well, thank you so much, Harriet. Because we've got the next session coming up at 11, I want to make sure those who want to attend that one can go into that one. So thank you so much for your time. I've always found what you've got to say so encouraging. I can see Kat is giving you some applause, and I'm going to give you a round of applause too.
Thank you very much.
And we've got some thank yous in the comments, but really we do appreciate all your wisdom, and Harriet is available. You can probably contact her through the app. I'm sure she will get the notification and get back to you. And we're just thankful you could join us today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. See you
all. Bye.
Bye.